How long-term sound exposure can gradually lead to tinnitus. Now, this is an educational discussion based on lived experiences, my own, and reputable sources, not medical advice. Now, to understand how tinnitus develops for many people, it is useful to look beyond single events and focus on patterns that build over time. There is often an assumption that tinnitus is caused by one specific moment, a loud concert, a sudden noise, or a clear incident that can be identified as the starting point. While that can happen, it is not always the case. For many people, tinnitus develops gradually. It is not tied to one event, but to repeated exposure over months or years. The change is subtle at first, and because it happens slowly, it often goes unnoticed until the signal becomes more obvious. The auditory system is constantly active. Every day it processes sound from the environment, converting vibrations into electrical signals and sending that information to the brain. This system is highly adaptable, but it is also sensitive to the level and duration of input it receives. When sound exposure is constantly elevated, even if it does not feel extreme in the moment, the auditory system has to adjust. The adjustment does not usually happen in a noticeable way at first. There is often no immediate discomfort, no clear change in hearing, and no obvious indication that anything is different. In many cases, everything feels normal for a long time. But beneath that, gradual adaptation can still be taking place. In environments where sound is part of daily life, this kind of exposure can become routine. For example, in music and performance settings, higher sound levels are often expected. As a singer, you are working with amplified sound, stage monitors, and venues where acoustics vary from one space to another. The focus is on performance. You are listening, adjusting, and responding in real time, but you are not necessarily evaluating the overall level of sound exposure in a conscious way. Now, myself as a DJ, the exposure can be even more sustained. Nightclub environments are designed around sound. The music is continuous, the volume is elevated, and sessions can last for several hours at a time. Over time, this creates a pattern of repeated exposure that becomes part of the routine. Individually, each session may feel manageable. There may be no sense that the sound is causing any issue. It becomes familiar, and familiarity often reduces the perception of intensity. But the auditory system does not only respond to individual moments, it responds to cumulative input. This means that repeated exposure, even at levels that feel acceptable in the moment, can gradually influence how the system functions over time. There is also a tendency for the brain to adapt to sound levels. What initially feels loud can begin to feel normal. This is a useful feature in many situations, but it can also make it harder to recognise when exposure is constantly high. Because the change is gradual, it does not always trigger awareness. Any form of exposure that is often overlooked comes from non-musical environments. Practical work, such as property renovation, can involve repeated use of tools that produce sharp or sustained noise. Drills, saws, cutting equipment, and other machinery can generate sound that is both intense and repetitive. When the focus is on completing a task, the sound itself can become secondary. In those situations, protective equipment is not always used consistently, especially if the work feels temporary or manageable. But even intermittent exposure to this kind of noise, when repeated over time, can contribute to the overall load on the auditory system. What connects these different experiences is not just volume, but repetition and duration. The system is not responding to a single point in time, it is responding to patterns. Over time, these patterns can lead to subtle changes in how sound is processed. The sensory cells within the inner ear are particularly important in this process. These cells are responsible for converting sound vibrations into signals that the brain can interpret. They are highly specialized and sensitive to the input they receive. When exposure is constantly elevated, these cells become less responsive. This does not necessarily result in an obvious or immediate change in hearing. In many cases, the change is mild or gradual. But even a small reduction in input can lead to a shift in how the brain processes sound. As discussed in earlier episodes, the brain is constantly seeking balance. When it receives less input than expected, it may increase its sensitivity in order to compensate. The increase in sensitivity can make internal neural activity more noticeable. And in some cases, that activity is interpreted as sound. This is one of the ways tinnitus can develop, not as a sudden event, but as a result of gradual adaptation within the auditory system and the brain. At first, the signal may be very subtle. It might only be noticeable in quiet environments. It may come and go. It may seem insignificant or significant. Because of this, it can easily be dismissed. But as awareness increases, the signal can become more noticeable. This does not necessarily mean it is becoming stronger in a physical sense. It means the brain is becoming more aware of it. There is also variation in how individuals experience this process. Two people can have similar exposure patterns and very different outcomes. This reflects the complexity of the auditory system and the many factors that influence how it responds. General health, stress levels, and differences in how the brain processes sensory input all play a role. The purpose of understanding this is not to create concern, it is to provide context. When tinnitus develops gradually, it can feel confusing because there is no clear starting point. But when viewed as part of a longer pattern of sound exposure, the experience often becomes easier to understand. It highlights that tinnitus is not usually the result of a single moment. It is the result of how the auditory system has adapted over time. There is also a useful perspective in recognizing that the same system that adapts to sound exposure is also capable of adapting in how it responds to tinnitus itself. The brain continues to adjust, learn, and refine its responses. While past exposure cannot be changed, the way the brain interprets signal is not fixed. Over time, many people find that the sound becomes less intrusive, even if it does not disappear completely. This reflects the brain's ability to reorganize how it prioritizes sensory information. There is also a nuance worth considering. Sound exposure does not always feel harmful at the time it is happening. In many cases, especially in music or work environments, the sound becomes part of the routine, feels normal, expected and manageable. Because of that, there is not always a clear moment where it would seem necessary to limit it. Looking back, it's often only with hindsight that the pattern becomes more obvious. It is not about one event, but about repetition over time. And that is an important distinction because it helps explain why tinnitus can feel like it appears without a clear cause. In reality, it is often the result of how the auditory system has adapted gradually. Understanding that can make the experience feel less sudden and less unpredictable. It places it within a longer term process rather than a single moment. There is also a practical side to the understanding. Recognizing patterns of exposure can change how sound is approached going forward. Not in a dramatic or restrictive way, but in a more aware and balanced way. The goal is not to avoid sound entirely. Sound is a normal and important part of life. It is about recognizing that the auditory system responds to patterns over time, and that awareness of those patterns can influence how the system is supported. This perspective also reinforces something important. Tinnitus is connected to normal processes within the brain and the auditory system. It is not something separate or unusual in that sense. It reflects how the system has adapted. And just as it has adapted in one direction, it is capable of adapting in another. Over time, as the brain becomes more familiar with the signal and less inclined To prioritise it, the experience often changes. The sound may still be present, but it is no longer central. And when something is no longer central, it becomes much easier for the brain to leave it in the background. That shift does not usually happen all at once. It develops gradually in the same way the initial changes developed. And understanding that gradual process can make the overall experience feel more consistent and easier to interpret. There is also another way to look at long-term sound exposure that can be useful. In many cases, the environments where exposure happens are not seen as harmful at the time. They are often associated with work, creativity or productivity. Whether that is performing, playing music, working in sound environments or carrying out practical tasks like renovation, the sound becomes part of what you are doing rather than something separate from it. Because of that, it does not stand out as something that needs to be managed. It feels normal, and anything that feels normal rarely triggers concern in the moment. That is why long-term exposure often goes unnoticed while it is happening. It is only later, when the auditory system has already adapted, that the connection becomes clearer. And understanding that timing can be important, because it shifts the perspective away from a single cause and towards a longer pattern of how the system has responded over time. The key point is that long-term sound exposure is not defined by one moment. It is defined by patterns, and tinnitus in many cases reflects even how the auditory system has responded to those patterns over time. Thanks for listening to this episode from the David Health Channel.